from the BBC World Service in association with ABC and All India Radio. This is Stumped.
Hello and welcome to Stumped, your intercontinental hit of news, features and debate from the quirky world of cricket. I'm Alison Mitchell in London, and there does seem to be a sense of optimism around the place at the moment. Certainly a sense of starting to open up after the COVID-19 complete lockdown. And regarding cricket, well, there's an important series of meetings taking place as we're recording, which might shine more of a definitive light on international cricket in the UK this summer. Although, of course, everything has to be signed off by the government and the touring teams. But there are even ideas being put forward as to some sort of domestic competition here in September and October. And wouldn't that be something? And ironically, we've been having some of the best summer weather that I can remember for a long time.
Hi, it's Jim Maxwell for the ABC here in Sydney, where it's cooling down. But the sporting world is warming up as I speak. The rugby league season is about to resume, one of the very few football competitions in the world that's about to carry on from where it was left 2 months ago. And as that's occurring, cricket's talking up tests against India. Looks like being confirmed pretty soon. Anyway, we'll keep speculating about all this. It's warming us up. Just the thought that we might actually have some cricket somewhere sometime. Isn't that wonderful, Charu?
Fantastic. Keep all our sporting fingers crossed. Hi, I'm Charu Sharma for All India Radio in Bangalore yet again. Happy to be home. And of course, I forget which lockdown we're at, 4.0 or 5.0 or whatever. It all ends this weekend. So we'll see what Monday will bring. But sport has opened up a shade. People are allowed to train, cricketers even, and there are lots of protocols in place still. But a lot of life seems to be returning to normal in our part of the world. Bangalore, by the way, is in the middle of massive storms. We have hundreds of trees uprooted. That spoiled our golf plans just a bit. Other parts of the country, 47 degrees C, so one of the hottest possible summers at this point of time. And add that to all the rest of the confusion because of the lockdown. We still are going through some tough times. But it looks like the world of sport is, as you said, Jim, gradually blooming again. That's wonderful news indeed.
Yeah, we can but hope. I'm yet to get the golf clubs out, but I have been out on my bike enjoying a bit of cycle around. There's bikes everywhere. I mean, that's going to be the cycling revolution perhaps after this, because we're still discouraged from using public transport as things go. But yeah, it does feel like some things are happening. Now, what about things that may yet happen or not happen? Because the rumours and reports were building that the men's T20 World Cup, which was scheduled for Australia in October, was going to be postponed. That meant that a slot would open up for the IPL, but the International Cricket Council in the week said that those reports were inaccurate, and they insist that planning for the World Cup continues. Quotes, whilst a number of contingency plans are being explored. So that feels a bit of a caveat there, sort of there's no change until there's change sort of thing. Charis, you mentioned sort of that the IPL meeting's happening while we're recording, so we can't bring you anything quite yet from that. But is this going to be a question of power as much as pragmatism when it comes down to windows for events? You've got to wonder. And Jim, we had the former Australian skipper Alan Border saying that the IPL shouldn't be prioritised over the T20 World Cup, whilst Ian Chappell has told Australian players that if an IPL happens, they should skip it if the dates clash with an Australian domestic competition. So what do you think the priority should be? What do you think it will be?
Well, I hope they come to an accommodation and they find a window for everything to fit in. And I'm not sure how that's going to occur. The one difficulty we're going to have in Australia, from where I'm looking in just the world of club grade cricket, is that because the football season looks like moving into September and October, there's a chance there won't be an opportunity to play any cricket of significance in Australia until October. So does that enable the IPL to go into that window without putting anyone out in terms of what's been arranged here or with the T20? So clearly, a domestic competition takes precedence, but money wins the argument most of the time. So a combination of the BCCI and the ICC want to have an IPL. Well, I'm sure they will have an IPL.
Well, there are many sides to this coin, aren't there? For starters, of course, not that the Indian fans will appreciate what the former Australian captains have said, but AB and Chappelli have a point. We're talking about the World Cup here versus what is essentially a domestic league. Yes, of course, there's a lot of money and it has a massive international flavor, but it is a domestic league. Now, is the ICC going to take control here and say, what is more important? What is our priority? Do we have the World Cup if we can host it? In Australia, for the moment, Jim seemed to still want to host it virtually at the same time. Or are we going to say, no, World Cup, forget it. It's just a piece of, what's the World Cup? It's nothing. Why don't we have the IPL instead, which suits one board or a couple of boards much more than all the rest of the people who'd be dying to play in a World Cup, and they don't know, speculation about when it's next going to be held or whatever. So from the Indian standpoint, I can also confirm that it's not sure yet, because the government has stepped in. The sports minister did mention something about the fact that I don't know about all these IPL noises. Remember, it will have to be the government that will have to finally decide whether we can host it or not. And of course, news about Saurav Ganguly, who's the president of the BCCI at this point of time, he and the secretary are hoping for an extension because they only had a 9-month tenure to begin with. And that apparently is also in question. So, there's a lot of balls flying in the air at this point of time. I will have to say the IPL is nowhere near being sure.
And of course, with the T20 World Cup, you've got to think of those nations for whom that is their pinnacle event, isn't it? They don't play in a 50-over World Cup, but they've come through qualifying, they've made it to that T20 World Cup, so there's a lot of moving parts. But whenever cricket does return, if it is in the near future, well, players are going to have to adapt to a new normal, aren't they? And we've spoken quite a lot on Stumped about, for example, the use of saliva to shine cricket balls, or rather not being allowed to use saliva to shine cricket balls. The ICC is set to implement that as a ban in June, after medical advice told them that spit does pose a risk of spreading COVID-19. Now, we've heard Australian paceman Mitchell Starc raising concerns that a temporary ban like this could hand batsmen too much of an advantage. And he's also said it could make the game boring, if they struggle to shine the ball to aid swing. From a health perspective, no less, though, how are cricketers going to be able to stop themselves licking their fingers to rub saliva into the ball? It's something which is an absolute habit. It's a habit which now needs to be broken. So let's bring in psychologist Emma Kenny, who's done a lot of research on habits and the idea of making and breaking them. Hello, Emma. Welcome to Stumped.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, just define a habit for us.
So researchers believe that a habit is something that's developed on an unconscious level due to a series of repetition, and it tends to be over a period of quite a long time. So you grow so used to it so that we'd use the term it becomes second nature. You can have good habits, you can have bad habits. So they're really reinforced and often quite difficult to break, and very unusual to need to break them unless it is something that causes you harm.
I'm glad we are talking about this, because I even just heard the other day England fast bowler Stuart Broad talking about the fact that he's been wearing a headband in training to stop sweat dripping down his face, because he said it's an automatic habit to use your fingers to wipe sweat off your brow, and they need to try to stop touching their faces too. General advice for all of us in COVID-19. So how hard is it to break a habit, but also to make a new one as well?
I mean, one of the things that you've just talked about there that's slightly different about the touching face is that part of being a human being is that we're instinctually programmed to touch our face. So it's almost impossible not to. In fact, it's part of how we spread bacteria, so we have good immunity. But when it moves on to the actual spit, they're hard to break because essentially it takes a lot of reinforcement to form them. And also, essentially, unless it's doing us a disservice or causing us a problem, which in this case, when it comes down to spit, it's not. It's part of the game. It's part of what cricketers have been doing for aeons. Therefore, it doesn't even have the negative reinforcement cycle. They are really hard to break. We believe it forms in like the basal ganglia of the brain. So the problem you've got with cricket is, firstly, you're talking about something temporary. And then secondly, you're talking about something that takes quite a long time to form. So it would be very easy to stop younger players who hadn't had that reinforcement constantly take that on. But when you're talking about people who spent their entire careers doing it, you're almost making it a more difficult game, because firstly, you're creating a non-automatic response, which is to have to not do a certain behaviour whilst trying to concentrate on a game. So if you're going to talk about what makes a game fair, then we have to go into the more unconscious processing of learned behaviours that they've connected with over time to develop their skill. If we're now going to put a blocker in that behaviour, which has a rule associated with it, that actually means that they've got to do something that becomes quite consciously challenging to do. You may find actually that really does impact on the individual's game.
Did you say the basal ganglia part of the brain? I'll throw that one over to Jim. I'm sure Jim knows all about different parts of the brain.
Oh no, all about it. But I know what instinct is, and I'm not sure where it comes in the
Yes.
brain, but
Yeah.
it certainly happens. So sports people, Emma, talk about instinct, and
Yes.
that's what makes them stand out from the rest. Do you think this will alter after this COVID pandemic?
I think that if you're talking about that kind of unconscious talent that comes from training and just feels like a natural fit, and then you add a blocker to that to some degree, it's not the same as learning a rule, for example, because you learn a rule that becomes an unconscious habit because you've learned the rule, and breaking that rule becomes very difficult because it's been there for a good reason and it's been reinforced. And particularly if you're highly professional and great at your game, it's been reinforced in lots of different ways. So there isn't even like a conscious understanding that it's become a habit, if that makes sense. It has, as you've said, felt like it's gone into the more instinctual area of the brain and become second nature. So if you definitely put a person who has been brilliant at what they do and then say, right, you now have to stop and think before you do every action that's become natural to you, because if not, you're breaking a rule, then suddenly you take that second nature, or as you put it, more of an instinctual response, and you put a blocker in it, which is, I have to think about this before I actually do it. So I definitely think that it will be problematic for people.
Can people be trained to understand that this is temporary? For instance, the whole saliva aspect is temporary. And people, for instance, have taken pretty quickly to not shaking hands and maintaining a little bit of distance. It's come very quickly, perhaps because of the fear. So because of the temporary nature, the potentially temporary nature of this, it might actually be easier to accept by cricketers, the whole saliva matter, for instance.
I mean, I think that human beings are massively adaptable. That's what makes us so incredibly inventive. That's why we've survived in the way that we've survived. It's why we're technologically advanced, because we like to be very adaptable. And if you think about lockdown, we've been, in my opinion, staggeringly compliant compared to what human beings are meant to be and do. I think that when you think about the long term, yes, people will be able to form habits and break habits because we do. It won't necessarily be positive for people playing the game. When it comes down to the more interactive, so hugging, kissing, connecting, you're fighting a really big, powerful instinct there. And whilst some people might be more comfortable with believing in an experience of fear, for most of us, exposure reduces it. So there'll always be some people who become completely different after this experience because they'll be traumatized. But most, pretty sensible human beings who spend time every day with other human beings will drop their fear because they form courage through exposure. And that's what we do in exposure work. I think that it will return to normal. And I think that in the long term, we'll probably also be a bit more realistic about how to handle being human. So there's a bigger, wider context. But in the game, for you guys, I think that it's a little bit strange to introduce a rule that is probably going to cause problems for the game. But if they do it, I imagine it will be temporary. And in the end, people will just second nature return to what made it work.
They're fascinating questions to answer, but you've shone quite a good light on those for us, Em. I just want to ask Jim and Chari whether have either of you tried to kick a habit or have you actually built any new habits into your life? I've managed to cut out sugar from my tea. I don't know whether that counts, but I've also tried to introduce, say, a meditation once per morning, and I have failed to succeed in that.
Well, Emma, I don't know how you can see this, but I do try very consciously to stay away from habits because I think it's just very constricting because, it's sort of like jail almost. The one not so dangerous habit that I try and kick every once in a while is having a morning cup of tea. Now, I know there's nothing wrong with it, but, you tend to get attached to it. And
Yes.
I, every once in a while, consciously say, okay, no tea for the next 10 days because I can't be that dependent on it. Can I? Should I? But it's all short term. I mean, just to sort of test myself.
Yeah, I love the fact that you make a habit of trying to prove that you don't need to make a habit. That's brilliant. That's a great habit to have. I think.
Jim, have you had to kick a habit?
I'm just sticking to my normal habits, and the most important habit is waking up in the morning.
Yes.
Well done for that.
That's
We're
a
very
good
glad
start.
that that's been happening. Emma, it's been great to get your perspective.
Lovely.
Thanks so much for
Take
coming
care.
on Stumped.
Bye-bye.
Psychologist Emma Kenny. Now, there has been a lot of speculation about what cricket might look like when this is all over, but also how the sport can keep fans involved if matches are played behind closed doors. Now, in football stadiums, they've already been trying a few different things to create an atmosphere. We've seen in Germany, they had some cardboard cutouts of supporters in the stands. Japan have developed an app that lets fans broadcast their live cheers and boos into speakers that are then planted inside the stadium. So those cheers kind of come in real time. But earlier this month, Danish club Aarhus believed that they found the best solution yet to the problem, and that was building virtual grandstands. What about this idea then of sort of wheeling in a giant screen, parking it up on the boundary rope, getting a zoom up, if you like, of maybe 50 faces in a gallery? Would they be in real time? Do you have the sound up the whole time? What do you reckon? Is that going to create some atmosphere, Jim?
It's all a bit phony for me. I think by the time we finish this conversation and we've moved towards playing cricket again, you'll see at least a handful, if not more, fans spread out, social distanced in the stadium. That's about to happen with the rugby league, which is starting here. It's all too phony otherwise. I mean, I know we play cricket in empty stadiums anyway, particularly Sheffield Shield cricket and maybe games in the UAE. Yeah, nothing beats the live atmosphere of a real crowd.
Just something I want to pick up, Cherry, with something Rahul Dravid, the former India captain, said during the week, because the sense of, I mean, it almost feels like we're slightly moving away from this sense of biosecure bubbles, what with this sort of optimism which is coming out. Rahul Dravid reckons that biosphere bubbles are unrealistic for a touring team to maintain.
Yeah, well, I read that too. I think it's a country-by-country situation. And I'm sure that he had India, for instance, or the subcontinent and other nations in mind, where it's so difficult to regulate anything in terms of the atmosphere. So, yes, in some countries where the population is very limited, I suppose a biosecure area can be ascertained. But in India, can you imagine the crowds outside that biosphere? And by the time they let in, what are they carrying or not? So it's all very complicated. And I know where Rahul's coming from. It's just the management of that biosecurity in very populous nations, for instance, or where security is not that tight, can be a nightmare. So then if it's a false biosphere, which is not really guaranteed, what's the point creating one?
Well, that's all for this week's Stumped on All India Radio. Don't forget you can get in touch with us at BBCWS Sport and use the hashtag BBC Stumped. My thanks to Cherry Sharma and Jim Maxwell and all of you for listening. Stay safe. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Stumped is a BBC sport production for the BBC World Service in association with the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and All India Radio.